44 years ago, a man named Mark Everett Reynolds vanished on his way home in Frisco, Texas, leaving no trace, plunging his family into decades of grief and doubt. Authorities initially suspected a crash, then turned their suspicions to those around Mark, but with no body, no witnesses, and a file missing pages, the investigation eventually stalled. Yet through all those years, someone quietly refused to give up, clinging to the hope that the truth about the night Mark disappeared still lingered, not yet swallowed by time, until an anonymous call from a hospital bed revealed a detail overlooked for 44 years, a detail potent enough to turn the entire case upside down in a way no one could have anticipated. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy investigative content like this, don't forget to hit subscribe. One summer evening in Frisco, Texas, the small town was still sparsely populated and retained the quiet charm that any longtime resident took for granted. Dirt roads, pockmarked and uneven, cut through fields of knee-high grass that swayed in the breeze like soft waves, while weathered, silver-gray wooden barns, bleached by the sun, stood scattered far apart, silent sentinels of rural Texas. The air, heavy from a long hot day, was cooling, carrying the scent of dry earth and a faint dampness from distant lakes. As Mark Everett Reynolds left work, the sky had turned a deep purple, with thin clouds draping the setting sun, casting a pale orange-red glow across the western horizon. He climbed into his familiar Ford F-150, an old but reliable truck that had faithfully served him through years of work at oil rigs and machine shops around Collin County. Mark always took the same route home each evening, a quiet road with hardly any houses, just open land, wooden fences, ranches, and silent farms. For him the drive was so familiar, he could navigate every curve with his eyes closed. At home, his wife went through her usual routine, preparing dinner. The kitchen was warm, with soft yellow light spilling onto a worn wooden table. The smell of food filled the room, mingling with the sound of a radio playing local news. On the front porch, the hanging lamp cast a dim glow across the small yard, illuminating the dirt path in a golden streak, as if reminding Mark that his family was awake, waiting for him. But when dinner was set on the table, and the chairs remained untouched in their usual places, Mark still hadn't returned. Time passed, and darkness enveloped the town. Street lights flickered on sporadically, but there was no familiar rumble of the F-150's engine, no sound of tires crunching on dirt, no slam of a car door, no footsteps on the stone path leading to the porch. His wife glanced out the window again and again, each time seeing the darkness deepen, the front yard stretching wider like an unanswered void. She called friends, neighbors, asking if anyone had seen Mark on the road, maybe he'd stopped to chat, or been delayed by something minor, like on rainy days. But every response was eerily identical: no, we haven't seen him. In a small town like Frisco at that time, people knew who was where, doing what, and when. For a man who took the same route for years to vanish without anyone seeing him, hearing his truck, or getting a late-night call was enough to send chills down anyone's spine. A heavy silence settled over the house, no longer ordinary, no longer harmless. It made every breath feel labored, every passing minute adding to the growing unease in his wife's heart. A cold shiver ran down her spine, an instinctive feeling, like knowing something was wrong, but being unable to explain it rationally. When no more excuses could calm her, the family picked up the phone and called the police. And in that moment, with that call, Mark Everett Reynolds' disappearance officially began, a vanishing so complete, so abrupt, it was as if he'd been swallowed by the very darkness of the small town he'd lived in his whole life. The evening turned to deep night as the missing person report was received, and within minutes, the first patrol car from the Frisco Police Department rolled out of the lot, heading south through town. The officers on night shift were used to rounding up stray livestock, dealing with drunks by the roadside, or chasing down mischievous kids, but an adult going missing before midnight was rare enough to immediately feel off. They started by checking the roads Mark usually took, bumpy dirt paths cutting through fields, curves only locals would know, the small wooden bridge over a narrow creek behind the old Vaughn farm. The first road showed nothing but dust clinging to the patrol car's tires, no glint of a license plate, No parked vehicle, no stray tire marks or skid lines suggesting a sudden crash. On the soft dirt by the barbed wire fence, there were only tracks from cattle and tractors from earlier in the day. No sign of a recent F-150. The patrol switched on their high beams, sweeping the light across the grass, but it revealed nothing. They moved to the second road, then the third. Interconnected routes like a web around the town, all leading toward Mark's usual path home. Along the road by the small creek to the east, the sound of flowing water mixed with the steady hum of the patrol car's engine, the air damp and cold under the wooden bridge. The lights scanned the water's surface, but no vehicle was parked below. No flecks of paint floated, no tire skids marked the dirt bank. If Mark had passed through here, everything was too clean. That uncanny cleanliness made the officers cautious. When a truck veered off a dirt slope near a creek, it always left long drag marks, churned earth, or at least a heavy skid. But the ground remained smooth, undisturbed. They expanded the search to the edge of an abandoned farm, where a horse ranch once stood, but now held only rotting wooden beams and empty stables. Flashlights swept through the deep shadows, but beyond the hum of insects and a few glinting animal eyes, there was no truck, no sign of anyone. The officers signaled to each other, silently agreeing that the possibility of Mark straying from his usual route was growing more suspicious. Near midnight, a second search team was dispatched. They fanned out, extending the radius from Mark's house, checking side roads, footpaths to the fields, and even routes only farmers typically used. The night wind picked up, rustling leaves against each other, stirring an uneasy feeling in the already tense air. A map was spread across the hood of a patrol car, with every possible point Mark might have passed marked, then crossed off as each was cleared. The road through the empty lot to the west, nothing. The path cutting through the old cattle ranch to the south, completely quiet. The road to the livestock barn behind the Parker farm, only tire tracks from the owner's truck. A young officer noted something odd. If Mark had run into trouble, whether a breakdown or a crash, there should be some trace. But miles of road showed only emptiness. His disappearance felt as if he'd never driven through that night. As the search teams pushed the perimeter a few miles further, their headlights swept across more open land, yielding no results. Bloodhounds were brought in, sniffing along the creek and roadsides, but they picked up no scent leading to Mark or his truck. This led some officers to quietly consider, though they didn't say it aloud, that the truck might not be on any of Mark's usual routes. As the night grew late and flashlight beams slowed with fatigue, the map on the patrol car hood had only a few unchecked areas left, far beyond their initial assumptions. The police pressed on, expanding the search step by step, moving beyond Mark's daily paths. And as the patrol cars tirelessly scanned the vast darkness, one thing became clear: Mark Everett Reynolds wasn't just running late. He had vanished from the roads he traveled every day, cleanly, silently, and without a trace. The search had found nothing, but the silence of those familiar roads was exactly what made the police begin to sense something far more unsettling than a simple case of a man getting lost. As the first light of dawn etched the horizon, the search teams continued scouring areas beyond Mark's usual route. The sky was still dim, with night fog blanketing trees and ground in a thin white veil, making everything seem hidden behind a faint haze. A search unit was sent to the dense woods on the edge of Lake Louisville, a few miles northwest of the main road, where rocky terrain and thick tree cover blocked nearly all light from the town's street lamps. This wasn't an area Mark typically passed through, but with all familiar roads empty, any direction could hold a clue. The team ventured deeper into the woods, along narrow trails leading toward the lake's shore. Thorny bushes and tangled roots formed barely visible paths. One officer leading the group caught a faint acrid smell in the air, a smoldering sharp odor, unlike wet grass or rotting wood. It could only come from one source: something had burned. They pushed forward a few dozen meters, crossing a gentle dirt slope, when a flashlight beam hit a large, blackened, twisted object perched awkwardly among the trees. An officer froze for a moment, then called the others to approach. What they saw beneath a layer of ash and lingering embers was a pickup truck, burned nearly to its frame. The steel was warped from heat, the glass shattered into tiny fragments across the ground, and the truck bed reduced to a blackened metal husk. Despite the damage, the license plate was still legible. A single glance was enough to make anyone's heart sink. It was Mark Everett Reynolds' Ford F-150. The officers stood in stunned silence for a few seconds, as if confirming to themselves that this wasn't a mistake. The truck they'd been searching for all night, the only evidence that could lead to Mark or explain where he was, now lay as a charred skeleton in the quiet forest. Even more shocking, Mark wasn't there, not in the cab, not in the bed, not in the nearby bushes, no trace, no hint of whether he'd left the truck, been dragged away or escaped somehow. Only the truck burned so thoroughly that no personal items could be identified. No wallet, no watch, no papers, no jacket. Mark often hung behind the seat. The ash and melted glass around the scene revealed nothing, except that the truck had been deliberately set ablaze, not the result of an accidental fire from an overheated engine or electrical fault. But at that moment, the police couldn't conclude anything definitively. All they knew was that Mark wasn't at the scene. A completely destroyed truck, and the total absence of its owner, that's what made the air feel heavier than the shade of the surrounding trees. One officer stepped back, surveying the area. The truck's position was off the main path, as if it had been brought here rather than driven. But the narrow, steep dirt trail leading down made it hard to confirm immediately. The ground around the truck was just ash, dry leaves and patchy burn marks. Above, a few tree branches still bore traces of soot. Everything suggested the fire was recent. A breeze from the lake stirred the light ash, revealing streaked burn patterns stretching from the hood to the cab. The scene was both silent and chilling, as if the truck had been placed here intentionally to hide something. The search team leader ordered everyone to step back and marked off the area with caution tape. Though they couldn't begin a formal investigation yet, they all understood this was no longer just a search zone. It was now the primary crime scene in Mark's disappearance. A silent scene, but one that raised more questions than anyone had anticipated. Why was Mark's truck in a place he never went? Why was it burned to nothing? And most crucially, where was Mark? No clear footprints to follow, no sounds suggesting recent movement, no calls for help or signs of a struggle, just the wind, the smell of ash, and the cold truth that the truck had been found, but its owner had not. In that moment, the entire search team realized this case had entered a new phase, one far beyond a man simply not making it home on time. The charred F-150 at the edge of Lake Louisville wasn't just the first piece of evidence they'd found, it was the first proof that Mark Everett Reynolds' disappearance wasn't accidental, but possibly tied to something far more serious. And it all began with this burned-out truck, in a silent forest with no footprints. Daylight grew stronger, filtering through the dense tree canopy, illuminating the blackened truck frame, lying motionless in a shallow dip near the forest's edge. The search team, after setting up a temporary perimeter, began carefully stepping closer for a more thorough observation. They weren't allowed to touch anything, but with what remained after the fire, they didn't need to. This was no accidental blaze. The chassis was burned evenly from front to back, a sign of an accelerant rather than a natural fire from electrical issues or engine heat. One officer knelt by the front tire, still partially intact, lightly tapping his flashlight against the ash caked around the rim. The ash was fine, like sand, indicating the fire had burned steadily and intensely for several minutes. No irregular clumps of melted metal, the kind you'd see if a gas tank had exploded spontaneously. Everything pointed to someone deliberately setting the truck ablaze with control. As they moved toward the rear, an officer paused. Beneath the ash, between two trees, was a long patchy drag mark, low and wide, unlike tire tracks or fire spread. He leaned closer, scanning it with his flashlight. It was a drag mark, a scraped path in the dirt, starting near the truck bed and extending a few meters beyond the burn zone, before fading into dry leaves. The mark wasn't deep, suggesting whatever was dragged wasn't heavy, like a vehicle or small container, but it was wide enough to rule out an animal. Its width, the spacing of disturbed soil, and its length suggested something soft, sizable, or a human body. No one at the scene said it aloud, but the team shared the same thought. They flagged the drag mark with 2 small stakes to avoid stepping on it, then continued checking the surrounding area. Every speck of ash, every burn streak, was examined by eye. One officer noticed black soot clinging to the base of a tree behind the truck, but the upper branches were untouched. This meant the fire was set from the ground up, likely by pouring liquid directly onto the chassis, a technique unlikely in an accidental fire. Moving to the right side of the truck, where the cab had collapsed entirely, another detail stood out. No personal items remained inside. No wallet, no watch, no ID papers, none of the things a long-time driver typically kept. No necklaces, rings, or metal personal effects. The items Mark always carried to work, at least one should have survived, as metallic ash or a charred fragment, but everything was gone. The cab was burned completely, yet showed no trace of personal items typically found in fixed spots like the glove box or under the seat. This left 2 possibilities. Either someone removed all of Mark's belongings before the fire, or Mark wasn't in the truck when it burned. The latter was clear from the moment the team arrived, but the former raised new questions. Why would someone need to erase every trace of Mark? An officer with experience in fire scenes used a high-powered flashlight to scan a 1-meter radius around the truck. The beam caught a small dark fragment wedged under dry leaves. Leaning closer, he realized it was a partially burned piece of fabric, its edges curled from heat but intact enough to show it wasn't like anything Mark typically wore. Mark favored denim shirts, thick cotton, and dark work pants. This fabric was lighter, softer, like polyester cotton blend, or a thin jacket. Its remaining color, a muted gray-green, didn't match the shirt Mark wore when he left work that evening. The fabric was unevenly burned, one part heavily charred, and another nearly intact, suggesting it wasn't in the truck when the fire started. It might have fallen during the truck's placement here, or from someone involved. Most striking was its location near the tailgate, where the drag mark began, as if someone had dropped it while working, or while moving something. As sunlight climbed higher, the scene grew clearer, and the team realized this quiet forest was no longer just a search area. It was the first place revealing that Mark's disappearance wasn't a mere accident. The ash, the drag mark, the empty cab, and the strange fabric all raised big questions with no answers yet. No one found Mark, and nothing of his remained. Only the truck, burned so thoroughly it seemed someone wanted to erase all traces of him. Everything at the scene was silent, but that silence spoke louder than any testimony they had at this point. And 3 details, the deliberately burned truck, the drag mark leading away, and the fabric not belonging to Mark, became the first signs of a complex story that at this moment, no one dared to fully imagine. That morning, as the perimeter around the burned truck scene was more clearly established, and officers finished noting their initial observations, the next task was to determine how Mark's Ford F-150 ended up in that location. No one in Mark's family, or among his colleagues, recalled him ever driving into the wooded area near Lake Louisville. It wasn't a shortcut or a familiar path to any farm Mark knew. This led officers to consider that Mark might not have driven the truck there himself. One of the search team leaders, familiar with the lake's terrain for over 2 decades, took a small wooden stick and lightly scraped the soil around the truck's front. The dirt here was fine, sandy and damp from the lake's moisture, but beneath the top layer, he noticed clumps of hard, sticky soil, bound together in a way unlike the natural dirt in this area. It was the kind of clay-heavy soil often found along northern trails, where farmers' heavy trucks passed, dragging sticky clay under their chassis that fell off in chunks when they stopped. This wasn't enough to draw a conclusion, but it suggested the truck might have traveled through roads far different from Mark's usual routes. To verify, they began examining open soil patches around the scene. They couldn't expect to find intact tire tracks, but there was a chance of finding distinct soil samples or tread marks. An officer knelt to inspect a patch of ground to the left of the truck, where ash hadn't fully covered the soil. There, under dark leaves, were faint impressions, like those pressed by a tire's edge, not as clear as fresh tracks but enough to indicate movement. Their uneven depth suggested the truck wasn't driven in normally, but was likely pushed lightly or guided in slowly. Another officer traced a possible path from the forest road to the truck's position. He walked the entry path, brushing against broken or scraped bushes. A few freshly snapped branches were low, as if someone had forced a vehicle between two shrubs rather than driven in at normal speed. This formed an initial theory: Mark might have been intercepted before reaching the woods, with the truck brought here afterward. The question now was, intercepted where, and by whom? A rough sketch was drawn at the scene. They marked the main dirt road leading to the woods, the spot where the tires stopped, the truck's front facing outward, and the area where ash spread. A veteran officer, who had investigated many vehicle accidents in remote areas, circled the truck and looked at the ground to its right. He pointed to a curved patch of compressed soil. The indentation was shallow, not too distinct, but the soil's distribution showed two types of tires had touched the ground around the same time. The F-150s, and another, smaller tire with thicker treads, only partially imprinted. This secondary tire mark wasn't enough to identify a brand or size, but it confirmed Mark's truck wasn't alone at the scene. One officer collected ash-covered soil samples from 3 spots around the truck into small nylon bags. He labeled each one near the front, one near the rear, and one at the drag mark's location. Field experience told him soil always carried a story, the type stuck to tires, caught in the undercarriage, or dropped during a vehicle's movement. If the soil where the truck was found differed from that on its undercarriage, it could reveal where the truck had been before entering the woods. As they ventured a few dozen meters deeper into the forest, an officer's gaze fixed on a patch of soil distinct from the rest, wetter, looser, as if recently disturbed. He used a stick to push aside decayed leaves. Beneath were tire tracks with distinct treads, the soil's compression, the tread's edge shape, and a short drag mark showed someone had carefully backed a vehicle into this spot. Not quickly or forcefully, but deliberately. All the evidence pointed one way: the truck hadn't arrived here on Mark's normal route. It had been moved, possibly after Mark was intercepted elsewhere. With this clue, the search team returned to the roads crisscrossing the woods to map possible routes, places where a perpetrator could stop a vehicle without being seen by passers-by. A theory took shape: if Mark was intercepted, it likely happened somewhere secluded enough to go unnoticed, but not too far from the woods to make moving the truck difficult. Such a road existed, an old dirt path running parallel to the northern fence of the Vaughn farm, a narrow track with bushes on both sides obscuring most visibility. They decided to revisit it, as a secondary vehicle or small truck could easily stop there without leaving obvious traces. As sunlight filtered through tall trees, the search team extended their inspection a few hundred meters along this dirt road. They examined disturbed soil patches, crushed dry leaves, and uneven soil mounds. An officer knelt to pick up a hardened soil sample, its color distinct from Frisco's natural dirt. "This looks like clay from the northern area," he said, "where many households use Firestone tires on their pickups." It wasn't definitive proof, but it aligned with the theory that Mark's truck had been taken through roads far from his usual path. As the team collected the last soil samples and marked additional notable impressions along the suspicious route, they knew this was just the beginning. The faint traces, subtle ground changes, every detail pointed to a chilling realization: someone had brought Mark's truck to the woods, deliberately, with knowledge of the terrain, and with care to avoid leaving clear evidence. The truck's path now became the most critical clue, as following it long enough might lead to where it veered from its familiar route, and perhaps where Mark Everett Reynolds vanished from his life. As the soil traces, drag marks, and the burned truck's position began forming the first picture that the F-150 didn't drive itself into the Lake Louisville woods, the police's task was to backtrack to the starting point, where Mark left work, and piece together every road he might have taken. They had no surveillance cameras, no phone signals, no truck black box like modern times. Everything relied on human memory, fragmented testimonies, each like a small piece with no clear place in a still blurry puzzle. But it was all they had. At the oil workshop where Mark worked, officers questioned everyone who stayed late. A colleague said, "Mark seemed tired, but as alert as usual, showing no signs of agitation or haste." Another recalled Mark forgetting a tool and returning to grab it before getting in his truck. These details held little investigative weight, but confirmed Mark left work entirely normally. A man living near the workshop said he'd seen Mark's F-150 pass through the neighborhood before, but couldn't recall if he saw it that day. Among the many questioned, only one, an elderly woman at a corner house, said she might have seen Mark's truck pass that afternoon, but admitted it could have been a similar truck. Such statements gave police little direction. Still, they followed Mark's usual route. The next stretch led to a convenience store on the roadside, where many workers stopped for drinks or snacks before heading home. When two officers entered and asked who was on duty last night, the young clerk nodded instantly at Mark's name. He said Mark stopped by to buy a can of soda and a snack pack. This was the first solid confirmation that Mark followed his route, at least to this point. A small but key detail: the clerk remembered Mark didn't linger. He bought his items and left, no chatting, no one with him. But when police asked if anyone else was in the parking lot at the time, the clerk paused for a few seconds, as if digging through his memory. There might have been a man standing by the vending machine outside, he said, not someone I recognized. I saw him looking toward the parking lot, but I was busy ringing up, so I didn't notice more. That was the first piece that made the police pause. A strange man, near the exit, looking at the parking lot, just as Mark was there. The clerk couldn't recall his face, clothes, or how he arrived, but his presence added a subtle weight to the air, as if someone stood at the story's edge, unnoticed. Police then asked people living nearby, trying to see if anyone saw Mark leave the lot or which way he went. A middle-aged man, fixing a wooden fence by the road, said he remembered a green truck passing, but wasn't sure it was the one you're looking for. Though uncertain, it was evidence Mark left the store and headed toward home. But just a few hundred meters past the store, all traces vanished. No one saw Mark, no unusual sounds, no one recalled anything more. Police returned to the burned truck's location and began connecting these points with the most likely route. It was a long dirt road through open land, one locals rarely used at night. As they drove it, daylight was clear. Morning sun made fine dust hang in the air. Police scanned the road for fresh tire marks, odd soil clumps, or unusual compression. But the road was so clean it offered no hint an F-150 had passed the previous night. An officer suggested that if Mark had driven through, he'd have left some trace, yet the ground recorded nothing. This leaned them toward the theory that the truck didn't reach the woods via the usual path. It was taken by another route, perhaps a side road, or stopped somewhere before vanishing from sight. Another witness, found as police dug deeper along the suspicious route, said he saw a truck parked out of place near a thicket. He wasn't sure whose it was, but recalled two figures standing together, looking like they were discussing something by the truck. He wasn't close enough to hear or thought it noteworthy then, but now, when police asked about Mark, this detail gained weight. Two figures, an unfamiliar truck, not enough to conclude, but enough to raise questions. Did Mark reach that spot, and if he did, was he intercepted there before the truck was taken to the woods? Piecing together these scattered testimonies, police realized that from where Mark left work to where the truck was found burned, only 2 points were certain. 1. Mark stopped at the convenience store. 2. The truck was found in the woods by the lake. Between them was a vast gap, a void no witness could fill. That void was where theories began to form. Mark might have been intercepted before the woods. Someone could have been waiting on a quiet road. The strange man at the store might not have been there by chance. And the two figures the witness glimpsed, however briefly, could be the first pieces of something far graver than they'd imagined. On the first night, they lost Mark Everett Reynolds. As the fragmented testimonies were gathered, and the gap between the convenience store and the woods where the burned truck was found grew increasingly suspicious, the police had to move to the next step, identifying those who might be connected to Mark's disappearance, or at least had a reason to interact with him that evening. In missing persons cases where the victim's vehicle is found completely burned, but no body is present, the circle of suspects always includes those with direct contact, personal conflicts, or unusual behavior around the time of the disappearance. In Mark Everett Reynolds' case, though described as easygoing with no serious disputes, the police quickly identified three notable figures to focus on. The first was Earl Donahue, Mark's co-worker at the oil workshop. Earl, about Mark's age, tall, quiet, had worked with him for years. They were said to get along on the job, but co-workers knew of another story. Mark and Earl had clashed over an unpaid sum tied to an oil rig repair project they both worked on months earlier. Some said Earl felt Mark hadn't been fair in splitting the money. Another recalled Earl raising his voice at Mark at the workshop, though no evidence showed outright enmity. The financial dispute made Earl the first to be questioned. When contacted, Earl seemed surprised by Mark's disappearance and insisted he hadn't seen Mark after their shift. But his slow, hesitant responses led officers to note that his movements that night needed closer scrutiny. Earl wasn't the only one with tension in Mark's orbit. The second suspect was Mark's neighbor, Glenn Hamlin, who lived behind the Reynolds property. Glenn, a middle-aged man with a volatile temper, was known for his irritability. Months earlier, he and Mark had a heated argument over a clogged rainwater drain that caused water from Glenn's yard to flood Mark's. They shouted at each other in their backyards, loud enough for neighbors to intervene. Since then, Glenn rarely spoke to Mark. Some said Glenn seemed jealous of Mark's steady job and frequent overtime, while Glenn faced seasonal unemployment. Though such disputes didn't prove involvement, for police any conflict was noteworthy, especially since Glenn was among the few who knew Mark's daily route home. When asked if he saw anything the night Mark vanished, Glenn said he went to bed early, didn't notice, and when questioned about their relationship, he claimed it was a small thing, long over. But something in how Glenn avoided eye contact led officers to note, not ruled out. The third figure, the most intriguing, was Terry Malone, a man Mark had accused of stealing a motorcycle 2 years prior. While working part-time at a garage, Mark reported Malone to police, suspecting he'd taken a customer's motorcycle during a moment of distraction and disappeared with it. Malone was arrested days later, but due to weak evidence, the charge was reduced to unauthorized use of property, and he was released. Since then, Malone harbored a grudge against Mark. A garage mechanic once said, he openly hated Mark. Any mention of Mark made him curse. Malone had claimed Mark ruined his life, making it hard for him to find work. When police approached Malone after Mark's disappearance, they quickly noted several red flags. Malone was agitated, lost his composure, and gave incoherent answers. Asked where he was the previous night, he claimed to be at his cousin's house, but offered no specific details. Those who knew Malone described him as hot-tempered, once drunkenly vowing to get even with Mark. This made Malone a top name on the suspect list. Yet, the biggest challenge was the lack of evidence tying any of the three, Earl Donahue, Glenn Hamlin, or Terry Malone, directly to the burned truck. No footprints, no items, no witnesses placing them near Lake Louisville's woods. Everything was circumstantial, not tangible proof. Even the convenience store clerk couldn't confirm if the man near the parking lot was one of the three. All had reasons for further investigation, but also gaps preventing them from being prime suspects. Glenn had a neighborly feud, but no one heard disturbances from his yard. Earl had a financial dispute, but co-workers said they'd returned to normal for months. Malone had the clearest motive, but no evidence showed he was near the woods. When all testimonies were laid out, the police saw they had a long but disjointed suspect list, like puzzle pieces from different boxes. No common thread, no cohesive sequence of actions, no factor elevating one above the others. Mark Everett Reynolds' disappearance, though just beginning, confronted police with a picture torn into fragments, each from a different story, none with a clear enough reason to act, yet none fully excludable. And while these suspects were just names on a list, the biggest question remained as stark as when the burned truck was found: who met Mark on that unseen stretch of road, and why did he never make it home? When the initial suspect list formed, but no one stood out clearly, the police returned to the burned truck scene to re-examine details they couldn't fully observe that first night due to darkness. The ground was now drier, the ash less damp, and remaining traces slightly clearer. The scene team fanned out, sweeping the area around the truck in widening circles, hoping to find something to bridge the gap between where Mark vanished and where the F-150 was reduced to a charred frame. One officer, a crime scene technician with expertise in tire tracks and vehicle movement patterns, lingered over a patch of ground a few meters from the truck. He crouched low, angling his flashlight parallel to the soil, casting a slanted beam to highlight every compressed contour in the sandy dirt. Faint, blurred arcs weren't enough to show a full tread pattern, but enough to reveal something critical. These weren't from Mark's F-150. He lightly touched a curved compression mark with his pen. Mark's truck had standard tires for daily use pickups, with wide, stable grooves and no vertical ridges at the edges. But this mark showed a partial zigzag pattern, typical of off-road or older specialty tires, a design far from common. Another officer approached. At a glance, he saw the difference. "These aren't Mark's tires," the scene technician concluded, voice low but certain. This discovery reshaped their view of the scene. If the tracks didn't match Mark's truck, at least one other vehicle was present at or near the time the F-150 was brought here. They expanded the search for tire marks, moving deeper into the bushes and softer soil patches beyond. Though the old forest's roots and decayed leaves obscured tracks, an officer found another short tread segment, just a few squares but consistent with the first. They marked each point with small sticks, tracing a possible path for the unknown vehicle. The tracks suggested it entered the woods, then turned in a wide arc, like a medium-sized truck's maneuver. Upon closer inspection, the technician noted a distinct detail. The zigzag edge pattern matched Firestone tires produced in the late 1970s, sold in limited batches in the Midwest and Southwest U.S. These weren't common, few in Frisco owned them. To confirm, he radioed the station to cross-check product registries. Some local shops still kept from that era. Shortly after, a response came within a few miles. Only a handful of people had bought these limited Firestone tires in the late 70s, mostly those into custom vehicles or families with old off-road trucks. The number was too small to ignore. Another investigator, familiar with local vehicle registries, joined officers on a patrol car hood to review data. They narrowed down a few names, mostly owners of vehicles with these tires: a rancher, a hunter, a former garage worker, and someone who lived near Mark's workplace. One finding stood out: a name overlapped with the initial suspect list, though nothing yet concretely tied them to the scene. Still, police knew tire tracks were a unique clue in disappearances involving destroyed vehicles. When perpetrators burn a vehicle to erase evidence, they often overlook one thing: the ground retains what fire can't destroy. Thus, the entire area around the truck was further scoured. Police used small markers to flag every spot with compressed soil. Among them, a strange tire track led deeper into the woods, but faded amid roots. Still, just two clear tread segments proved another vehicle was at the scene near the time the F-150 was burned. And if a second vehicle was there, the odds of Mark driving himself into the woods plummeted. Those present grasped the finding's weight. Though unspoken in many cases, secondary tire tracks are the first clue to a perpetrator. Not definitive proof, but a pointer, something that could lead investigators to those familiar with the terrain, and with reason to bring Mark to such a remote spot. By late morning, as the team temporarily left the scene to consolidate information, a new sketch of the disappearance emerged. Mark's truck didn't reach the woods naturally. It was brought by someone using rare tires owned by only a few locally. And in a still fragmented suspect list, this small detail suddenly became a critical compass, opening a new investigative path no one expected would prove so pivotal in the months ahead. When the strange Firestone tire tracks were noted, and data on their owners began narrowing the investigation, police revisited all initial testimonies from the night Mark vanished. They wanted to see if any detail was missed, common in the chaotic early hours when the town was still grappling with what happened. As expected, a key testimony surfaced, initially overlooked. The witness was a 14-year-old boy, living a short field away from the suspicious dirt road. The night Mark disappeared, he told police he saw two men dragging something into a truck from a distance, under the light of an abandoned shed's porch lamp. He described them pulling a dark object, then quickly closing the truck bed. but because he saw it from a second-floor window, across a wide field in dim light, his account was noted as uncertain. In 1980, with security cameras nearly non-existent and minors deemed less reliable than adults, such testimonies were easily dismissed. Plus, the night shift officers were swamped with scattered information, from panicked callers to speculative guesses, causing the boy's statement to blend into the paperwork and lose the weight it deserved. But when the current team reread it, it grabbed their attention: two men. Until now, theories centered on Mark being intercepted by one person, but two men, if true, explained much, including how the F-150 was moved to the woods without skid marks or signs of a sudden stop. Two people could coordinate better than one, especially when moving a heavy object or burning a truck without injuring themselves. They placed the testimony in context. Around the same time, the strange Firestone tracks appeared at the scene, a rare tire type, used by few, typically those into custom vehicles or sport trucks. Two figures, a unique tire, a burned truck moved to the woods. When pieced together, police saw the boy's account wasn't as vague as initially thought. While reviewing the young witness's statement, police also rechecked the timelines provided by initial suspects. Most relied on memory, lacking physical proof, but one showed a clear gap. It was Earl Donahue, Mark's co-worker with a lingering financial dispute. Earl claimed he went straight home after the workshop and stayed there all night, saying his wife could confirm, but when police verified, Earl's wife seemed confused, saying she went to bed early and couldn't recall exactly when he got home. When pressed a second time, Earl changed his story, saying he stopped at a gas station before heading home. This was odd. Those uninvolved typically remember clearly where they were the night someone they knew vanished, knowing they need an accurate timeline. Yet Earl's account shifted within one conversation. Further, when asked about his route, Earl described a longer than usual detour, claiming he liked avoiding busy roads, but officers knew the road he mentioned was barely used at night, dimly lit, rough, not a route someone tired from a long workday would pick. This inconsistency led police to note Earl needed closer monitoring, though it wasn't enough to charge or formally designate him a prime suspect. It was just small details, but paired with the boy's two-men account, the picture gained depth. Still, police knew a critical truth: in early stages of missing persons cases, too many fragmented testimonies can mislead. They had to be cautious, analyzing each detail without rushing to conclusions. They laid out three pieces on the table: the overlooked young witness's testimony, the rare Firestone tire tracks owned by few, and a suspect with an inconsistent timeline. Though not directly linked, all pointed to one thing: Mark Everett Reynolds' disappearance wasn't simple, accidental, or the result of a careless mishap. Something larger, more complex lurked behind the overlooked details. And as police tried piecing these fragments together, they didn't yet know that years later, these seemingly minor details would unlock one of the most shocking cold cases Frisco ever faced. In the early days after Mark Everett Reynolds vanished, Frisco police did everything a small 1980s town could. They scoured every dirt road, questioned every acquaintance, checked every detail from the burned truck to conflicting testimonies. But no matter how hard they tried, the harshest truth grew clearer daily. No mark, no body, no solid evidence. In criminal cases, a body often anchors the crime, cause of death, time of incident, and other key factors. But here, Mark vanished, as if swallowed by the void between the convenience store and Lake Louisville's woods. The burned truck was the only physical evidence. The strange Firestone tracks, compressed soil, drag marks, all were vague clues, insufficient to charge anyone or fully define a crime. When Mark's family asked if he could still be alive, investigators couldn't even give a clear answer. No evidence he was killed, no evidence he left voluntarily, no evidence of what happened to him. It was the worst scenario for any investigation: a missing person with no body, no witnesses, no decisive clue. Investigators sent soil, ash, and collected items to a lab, but 1980 testing was limited. DNA wasn't widely used. No national databases like CODIS existed, no tech for analyzing microfibers, trace blood, or surveillance footage. Results boiled down to a few lines. Soil showed multiple tire types, ash revealed no personal items, and the burned fabric's origin couldn't be traced. A veteran Frisco PD officer once exclaimed in a meeting, "We have traces of a crime, but no crime confirmed." That summed it up. Police knew something was wrong. They knew the F-150 didn't burn itself. They knew Mark didn't drive it there, but they couldn't prove anything specific. When interrogations of Earl Donahue, Glenn Hamlin, and Terry Malone yielded no clear results, the case began sliding toward a dead end. Earl had a dispute with Mark, but no evidence placed him near the woods. Glenn was a hot-headed neighbor, but nothing showed he left home that night. Malone had the clearest motive, but no witnesses confirmed his whereabouts, and no evidence tied him to the burned truck. One by one, they were dropped as prime suspects, not because they were innocent, but because guilt couldn't be proven. Police pushed to find Mark. They searched more woods around the lake, dug up suspicious plots, used boats to scan the shoreline, even enlisted local hunters to check private lands, but all came up empty. A week passed, then a month, then 3. Missing person flyers for Mark faded from bright white to yellowed, frayed edges from rain and wind. The family kept calling, asking police about every new rumor from neighbors, but all were meaningless gossip, townsfolk's attempts to fill the void, as the town grappled with a bizarre disappearance. By year's end, the case was officially inactive, not because police gave up, but because 1980s law and procedure couldn't sustain a dedicated team on a stalled case. A file was closed, stored away. On its cover, just a few lines: Reynolds, Mark Everett, missing, burned vehicle. No body, no conclusion. Mark's family kept asking, waiting, hoping someone would find him in another forest, or that one day he'd walk through the door as if he'd never left. But time gradually filled their lives with silences and doubts. Doubts that the truth might lie within the details police collected, but couldn't piece into a complete picture. Frisco, then still a small town of a few thousand, slowly accepted that Mark Everett Reynolds might be one of those men who vanished without a trace. Many spoke of him as a sad tale, a cautionary story in the town. But as years passed, even that faded. The summer of 1980 came and went, then 1981. Then the years after, the town grew, houses sprang up, new people arrived in droves. Those who witnessed the story's start moved away, retired, or passed on. And Mark's case became just an old file in a small storage room behind the police station, where flickering fluorescent lights and dust coated the edges of metal cabinets. No body, meaning no prosecution, no DNA, meaning no suspect identification, no new leads, meaning the case was frozen. But what no one knew then was that the last two wouldn't hold forever, and that frozen file, though forgotten for years, sat in the cabinet like an ember waiting to be reignited. When science advanced, people changed, and the silence of the past could no longer keep its secrets. Years after Mark Everett Reynolds' file was shelved, the case nearly vanished into silence. Only a few older officers still recalled the charred F-150 in the Lake Louisville woods and the weeks of fruitless searches. But when Frisco PD overhauled its storage unit in the early 90s, a routine administrative task sparked the first surprise tied to the case. A young officer tasked with organizing old backlogged files in the metal cabinets opened a box labeled FR 1980 red, and noticed the file was thicker than typical missing persons cases. Regulations then required files to be clipped in order. Witness statements, scene notes, collected evidence, and investigation assignments, all were in the file. But when he checked the handwritten table of contents on the first page, one detail made him pause longer than expected. Two key entries: the statement of the young witness near the vacant lot, and a short note from the night shift officer, were marked attached in the index, but missing from the file. These pages should have followed the initial scene report, but they were gone. Not folded, not torn, no signs of being ripped out, they simply weren't there. When the young officer cross-checked the 1980 file list, he confirmed the pages had once existed. The numbering jumped from item 12 to 14, skipping the exact spots for the missing statements. He called the storage manager, then reported to his superior. In any case, missing files weren't rare, especially in an era of handwritten notes, paper clips, and metal cabinets. But losing two numbered, indexed pages critical to the investigation's early phase was entirely different. When the captain reviewed it, he realized this couldn't be a mere clerical error. Both missing pages tied to the moment police were trying to determine if Mark was intercepted, the moment the boy's two men's statement first appeared, but went unnoticed. The first page was the boy's account, the second was the night shift officer's note written after taking it. The coincidence was too big to ignore, but what made it even more suspicious was the signature of the officer handling initial evidence and file inventory. Robert Kincaid, a logistics officer, who left the department just a year after the disappearance. When Kincaid's personnel file was reviewed, a curious detail emerged. He quit abruptly, without notice, not due to retirement, but for personal reasons. The file noted this in a single line, no further explanation. Oddly, his departure coincided with police concluding the case couldn't progress due to lack of evidence. When former colleagues of Kincaid were asked, they described him as reserved, private, but no one recalled him being involved in Mark's investigation. Yet all agreed on one thing: Kincaid was the only one then with full access to evidence and documents, even in the chaotic early days before files were sorted. If someone wanted to remove 2 pages unnoticed, Kincaid was the most capable. Another question arose: why would he do it? Who asked him to? Or did he act alone? No one had answers. When checking subsequent file transfer logs, police found no notes about alterations to Mark's file or reports of missing pages. This meant the pages vanished early, not during later storage years. An early intervention, when the case was still hot. Some older officers recalled that in the investigation's first days, information flooded in. Some witnesses gave emotional accounts. Some details were scribbled hastily. In that chaos, a few missing pages didn't raise alarms. But decades later, losing the 2 most sensitive pages suggested something else. This wasn't a coincidence. Police reviewed the accompanying evidence file: soil bags, burned fabric, ash. The 1980 evidence description also had an anomaly. Kincaid's signature appeared multiple times, but lacked a second signature for cross-verification, common in standard files. Clearly, 1980 procedures were lax, but it was also clear that if someone wanted to add, remove, or swap documents, this was the perfect time. A young officer in the file review team said bluntly, "The evidence signer left the PD a year after the case, and the 2 most critical pages are gone. This isn't a clerical error, this is interference." The words hung in the meeting room for a long moment. No one knew what happened in the early days of Mark's disappearance. It could have been the era's sloppiness, but it could also be someone ensuring a statement never got attention. Either way, the missing pages opened a dark corner no one saw initially. Mark Everett Reynolds' case wasn't just frozen for lack of evidence, it might have been stalled from within, a truth that made the case colder and more chilling. The years transformed Frisco beyond recognition. From a small community by fields and barns, it became one of Texas' fastest-growing cities. Houses rose, roads were paved, streetlights stretched to once empty lands. As the city grew, old cases, dusty files in storage, faded from most residents' minds. But as Frisco expanded, so did the police force and Texas' legal system. New technology, procedures, and community expectations pushed law enforcement to revisit unsolved cases from decades past. In 2024, the Texas Rangers, the state's elite criminal investigators, announced a new cold case review unit, funded by a statewide program to expand unresolved case investigations. This standardized unit wielded modern DNA tech, microscopic evidence analysis, and access to Texas's historical crime data, including cases from the 70s and 80s, once handwritten. When the unit began reviewing old files, they prioritized cases with 1. Preserved evidence, 2. Overlooked witness statements, 3. Signs of early interference or errors, 4. Vague clues now analyzable with new tech. Mark Everett Reynolds' case hit the table early, not because it was famous, not because someone recently mentioned it, but because while scanning data on missing persons cases in Collin and Denton counties from 1975 to 1985, an anomaly popped up in the Rangers' automated analysis. The limited edition Firestone tire tread from Mark's case appeared in another 1981 disappearance. That case involved Gary Hutchinson, a 32-year-old pickup driver in Denton, who vanished while hauling goods through northern farmland. His truck was found on a field's edge, not burned but abandoned with the door open. Nearby soil showed strange tire treads, the rare Firestone zigzag, that Denton County Police then deemed too unclear to use. No one then connected the cases. No one thought two men disappearing 2 years apart were linked. But modern tire tread morphology analysis, digitizing old photo scans and matching them to standard patterns, did what 1980 couldn't. It confirmed the treads from both scenes were identical. Same model, same era, same type. Both belonged to a limited edition Firestone, sold briefly in the Southwest and Midwest, before discontinuation. This flagged Mark's case as potentially linked to a multi-case offender, meaning the person behind Mark's case might tie to Hutchinson's, or at least both cases involved someone using the same vehicle. This elevated Mark's case to a priority even Frisco PD didn't anticipate. When Texas Rangers met with Frisco PD to collect the file, they were stunned to learn of the 2 missing statement pages in Mark's case. This was immediately marked as an anomaly requiring review. Rangers requested the entire original file, including evidence never analyzed with modern tech, burned fabric scrap, soil samples from 3 spots, photos of the burned truck scene, reports on the drag mark, notes on the strange Firestone tread. While many cases from that era lost evidence, Frisco PD's was remarkably intact. Even the burned fabric and soil, stored for decades, remained in old nylon bags, yellowed but undamaged. Rangers sent them to the Dallas DPS lab, equipped with trace DNA analysis, electron microscopy, and geographic soil profiling tools. But before results came, they dug deeper into the paper file. The 2 missing pages were a serious red flag, and when reviewing the evidence signatory, Robert Kincaid, and his abrupt departure, they began questioning if the file was deliberately tampered with. Rangers requested all document logs from the early period, and when cross-checking signatures, they found something more troubling. Some of Kincaid's signatures weren't entirely consistent. Not enough to prove forgery, but enough to suspect not everything was documented transparently. Both factors, the Firestone tread match in 2 disappearances, and the signs of missing pages and unverified signatures in Mark's file, shifted the case from missing person to potential interference and multi-case suspect. In an internal memo, a ranger noted, in 1980, tech couldn't spot the pattern. In 2024, it's different. Tire treads don't lie. Missing pages aren't random. This isn't just a disappearance anymore. Frisco, now a modern city, replaced Mark's old dirt roads with smooth asphalt, signs and LED lights. The wooded lake edge where the burned truck was found is now near hiking trails and campgrounds, no longer desolate as in the 80s. But this change fueled the cold case team's resolve. If they were to retrace Mark's path, it had to be now, before time erased all traces. Texas Rangers reconstructed that night's route using GIS tech, building a 1980 terrain map from old satellite images and dirt road plans. They tried picturing how Mark drove from the workshop home, which road he might have been intercepted on, which spot was secluded enough for another vehicle to approach unnoticed. And when comparing Mark's route to Hutchinson's in 1981, both cases shared a trait: they occurred near intersections with sparsely traveled dirt roads north of Frisco, just miles apart. To the Rangers, this wasn't coincidence. It was a lid dormant for 44 years, until old tire treads, new tech, and a file with missing pages brought it back to life. As Texas Rangers began reconstructing the 1980 route and uncovered the eerie overlap between Mark Reynolds and Gary Hutchinson's 1981 cases, the whole unit braced for a long investigation. No one expected the biggest clue to come from an overlooked source, an anonymous call one afternoon in May 2024. The call hit Frisco PD's switchboard during a shift change. The number wasn't a landline, but an internal line from a Denton County hospital. The operator assumed it was a routine medical assistance request, until a man's voice came through, weak, hoarse, strained by heavy breaths. The voice started with a single line, "I need to talk to someone handling the Reynolds case." The one from 80. The operator froze. Few still connected the name Reynolds to a criminal case. Most thought it was just the surname of one of Frisco's old families, not a disappearance. But the man gave her no chance to ask further. Gasping, he continued. "They need to go to Rhea Mills Ranch, the old cabin. I don't have much time." The halting words, interrupted by dry coughs, made the operator think he was having a heart attack or respiratory failure. She quickly transferred the call to the investigation team, working with the rangers. A ranger named Alvarez picked up. "Who's this? Can you give me your name?" On the other end, a few seconds of silence, mixed with background noise, beeping heart monitors, faint IV drip alarms, the sound of hospital bed wheels rolling down a hall. No doubt, the man was calling from a hospital, likely in critical condition. Then his voice returned, soft but clearer. "Go to the old cabin, at Rhea Mills Ranch. That's where Mr. Reynolds, where it all started." Only then did the call turn chilling. The Rangers hadn't publicized any details about reopening Mark's case. No public announcements, no news articles, no press conferences. Everything had only been internal for a few weeks. So how did this man know? Alvarez pressed, "What do you know about it? Who are you?" Silence. Heavy breathing. Then a fragmented phrase. "I should have said something long ago." The last sound before the call ended was someone in the hospital room shouting, "He's passed out," before the line cut off. Rangers immediately called back the displayed number. It was the switchboard for Methodist Denton Hospital. When they requested verification of patients in critical care or ICU at the time of the call, the hospital reported an elderly patient admitted about half an hour earlier, no ID, reduced consciousness, only a few personal items, and a phone number scrawled on a piece of paper. The man couldn't speak immediately. The ICU doctor said he was in severe heart failure, unlikely to be fully conscious for hours. Rangers dispatched personnel to the hospital. They collected the man's belongings, an old wallet, no ID, no bank cards, a worn lighter, and a crumpled paper with scrawled words. "Rhea Mills, North Cabin, Summer 80. Next to it, a faint line, smudged by sweat or water, "Sorry." There was no way to identify the man then, but the Rangers couldn't wait. North Cabin Rhea Mills Ranch was a specific coordinate. Rhea Mills Ranch was once a vast privately owned property, later abandoned for years. In the 80s, it had 3 wooden cabins used as temporary housing for seasonal workers. By the late 90s, parts of the land were neglected, overgrown with trees, and the cabins deteriorated beyond recognition. No one mentioned Rhea Mills Ranch in the 1980 file. It was never considered a crime scene. No one ever linked Mark to it. Yet the mysterious caller insisted, that's where it all started. That afternoon, a joint Frisco PD and Texas Rangers team headed to Rhea Mills Ranch. Upon arrival, the sprawling land appeared as a relic of the past: chest-high grass, rotting wooden fences leaning over, and time-worn cabins. Of the 3 cabins once there, only 2 remained partially intact. The third had been destroyed by a storm years ago, leaving only a scorched wooden foundation and a collapsed frame. But the north cabin, the exact spot noted on the man's crumpled paper, still stood, though crooked. As Rangers approached, a musty smell of damp and rotting wood hit them. Peeling wooden walls, broken windows, a leaking roof. A cabin untouched for years. But near the entrance, something stood out. The ground by the porch was unevenly compressed, with patches of soil disturbed as if someone had stood there or dragged something across. And at the door's edge, among decayed leaves, an officer knelt and picked up a small object, an elliptical metal piece, rusted but with faint letters readable, "Fire, Tone 7. Rangers exchanged glances. It resembled part of a Firestone tire patch once affixed to the inner lining of certain limited edition tires from the late 70s. An abandoned cabin, a hospital call, an old Firestone metal piece, and a location never mentioned in the original 1980 file. As afternoon sunlight, bathed the desolate land. Rangers knew one thing clearly: someone was at Rhea Mills Ranch in the summer of 1980, someone who knew something no one else did for 4 decades, or dared not speak. And now, that person, with their last breaths, had led them to where it all began to unravel. Rhea Mills Ranch was no longer a vague hint, it was the starting point of the truth. When the old Firestone metal piece was found by the north cabin's porch at Rhea Mills Ranch, Texas, Rangers immediately ordered the area sealed off. The cabin, though rotting and abandoned for decades, now became the investigation's focal point. They didn't yet know what happened here, but the mysterious hospital call, "Old Cabin, where it all started," echoed in each mind, like a final puzzle piece seeking its place. The next morning, as sunlight pierced the dense tree canopy, the Rangers' forensic team arrived with specialized equipment, ground-penetrating radar (GPR), a tool often used to detect buried pits, objects, or disturbed soil over time. The device, mounted on a flat cart-like frame with antennas, sent electromagnetic waves deep into the ground, recording differences in subsurface layers. For old cases like Mark's, GPR could revive secrets unseen 40 years ago. Rangers began scanning around the cabin. The ground here was softer and looser than other areas, an early sign of past digging or disturbance. Grass grew sparsely, and the lower soil was paler than North Texas's natural dirt. Within minutes, the GPR screen showed irregular curved lines. The operator paused, frowned, then pushed the device back in the opposite direction for a cross-check. The results were identical. "Something's down there," he said. And not just one layer. Rangers gathered around the screen. The radar's wave reflections revealed soil disturbed at 3 different depths, 3 layers of time. The top layer, about 30 cm, showed relatively recent disruption, dug and refilled, not within recent months, but possibly years earlier. The second layer, 60, 70 cm, displayed a backfill subsidence pattern, typical of a large burial pit filled in, with soil manually packed rather than naturally settled. The third layer, over a meter deep, showed a different shape, a pit with straight edges, like one dug by a tool, not natural. At least 3 times the soil was dug up and refilled, the operator concluded. This doesn't happen with just trash or random objects. This is deliberate, repeated behavior. The air around the cabin grew heavy. There had to be a significant reason for someone to return to the same spot over years, digging, filling, digging again, like someone was hiding something, or moving it elsewhere. Rangers expanded the GPR scan behind the cabin. There, the device showed a strong reflection, consistent with a solid buried object or man-made structure, like wood, metal, or old concrete. One ranger dug a few centimeters by hand, then stopped when the shovel hit something hard, not enough to uncover it, but enough to confirm a man-made object below. They marked the area with plastic stakes, noting it on the scene map. From an investigator's perspective, soil disturbed at 3 temporal layers told a clear story. Someone returned to this cabin multiple times over 40 years. Not by chance, not naturally, not due to environmental shifts. This was purposeful action. The scene commander, Ranger Alvarez, stood before the cabin, surveying the area. The rotting wooden door swayed lightly in the breeze, creaking as if guarding secrets it didn't want to share. Alvarez looked at the ground, then said slowly, "Someone buried something here," then came back to dig it up, and buried it again. No one does that without a big reason. He ordered a halt to digging immediately. Manual digging without understanding the soil structure could damage evidence or disrupt temporal layers, unacceptable in a cold case. The forensic team brought more equipment, high-precision GPS locators, layered soil marking tools, and a microscopic camera to document the surface before disturbance. Every centimeter was measured, noted, photographed. They found the deepest layer showed unnatural compression, like soil tamped down with a heavy object. The middle layer was looser, consistent with a pit dug up and refilled quickly. Oddly, the top layer showed a different disruption, not pit-like, but as if someone cleared the surface, perhaps to clean or hide traces. One technician commented, 3 layers of disturbance mean 3 events, 3 different times, possibly years apart. Another ranger asked, if someone buried something in 1980, then dug it up, why, and when, and why bury it again? No one could answer. Only one truth stood: Rhea Mills Ranch wasn't just a place someone visited, it was a place someone returned to, multiple times. The more they examined, the clearer it became that this cabin wasn't a random spot the anonymous caller mentioned. He knew something no one else had for 4 decades. As soil samples were packed for lab analysis of age, organic content, and trace molecules, rangers took one last look at the old cabin before leaving the scene. In the afternoon light, the GPR's reflection lines lingered on the device's screen, like shadows of a burial pit, hidden for years. No one said it aloud, but all understood. They'd found the starting point of the truth. But what lay beneath those 3 soil layers, buried, dug up, buried again, might surpass anything they imagined. The next morning, as faint sunlight filtered through the tall grass around the north cabin at Rhea Mills Ranch, the Texas Rangers forensic team was ready for the toughest phase: manual digging. Heavy machinery couldn't be used. Every vibration, every shovel blade could ruin evidence in the 3 disturbed soil layers GPR had detected the day before. Everything had to be slow, precise, almost surgical. The area was cordoned off with marking tape, and the entire ground before the cabin was covered with a grid to prevent wind from blowing leaves or dust onto the scene. Forensic specialists, in white protective suits and gloves, knelt at the edge of the area with the strongest GPR response. They began with the top soil layer. The dirt here was unusually soft, crumbling easily, unlike the hard, sticky native soil of North Texas. One technician speculated, this layer was recently disturbed, maybe within the last few years. The comment wasn't meant to confirm anything, but it thickened the silence around the cabin. As the surface soil was cleared, a noticeable shift appeared. The dirt grew darker, looser in texture. This was the second layer, where GPR had detected a backfill compression pattern, as if someone had dug a deep pit and filled it quickly. Each small shovel stroke went down carefully. No one spoke, no one wavered. Only the sound of metal scraping earth, evidence bags being opened, and the camera's dry clicks recording every centimeter dug. Then everything changed. A technician abruptly stopped, staring at the tip of his shovel. He said nothing, but the colleague behind him saw his face shift. He leaned closer, brushing dirt with gloved fingers. A faint white curve emerged. Not a rock, not a root, bone. The air seemed to freeze for a few seconds. They immediately switched to forensic recovery protocol. Widen the area around the bone. Don't lift, don't touch heavily, don't shift it. Photograph from above, someone said softly. The camera clicked, light glinted off the pale bone, stark against the dark soil. As a few more centimeters of dirt were cleared, the shape clarified. A partial shin bone, broken in the middle, its edges worn but uneven, a sign of long-term decay. One ranger whispered, "This could be Mark." No one responded, but all knew after 44 years, this was the first real evidence tied to his disappearance. Digging continued in a widening spiral. The deeper they went, the darker the soil, showing heavy disturbance from years ago. Then another bone appeared, larger, a curved rib section. Then a third, a small pelvic fragment. A technician placed a ruler beside it, noting male approximately 30-40 years old. Mark was 34 when he vanished. The match made everyone hold their breath, but as they dug deeper, something felt off. Some bones in the cluster were anatomically misplaced, an arm bone near a leg bone, ribs mixed with soil at varying depths. This suggested one thing: the body had been moved, possibly when the pit was redug years later. Not only that, the bones weren't intact. Some breaks had sharp edges, others were worn by time and soil. A forensic technician observed, this body may have been buried, then dug up, then buried again. The disturbance scrambled the structure. The statement aligned perfectly with the GPR data: 3 temporal layers, 3 events. As they dug to the pit's left, a long flat component appeared at a different depth from the bones just found. A technician knelt close, brushing dirt with a soft tool. This is, he paused, a bone fragment, no larger than a thumb, with a thin flat head. Though its anatomical position wasn't yet clear, One thing stood out immediately: its size didn't match Mark. Mark was tall, with thick, sturdy bones. This piece was too small, too delicate, belonging to someone much slighter, possibly a woman or teenager. The heavy atmosphere around the cabin thickened suddenly. This was when one ranger spoke softly, almost just for the team to hear. "We have more than one victim." Silence fell over everyone. They carefully packed each bone into preservation bags, larger pieces in hard cases, smaller ones in micro-evidence bags. Each was numbered, tagged with precise GPS coordinates, depth, and shape. No one wanted to say it, but as they laid the bones on a temporary sorting table outside the cabin, the obvious emerged: larger bones, thick and sized for Mark Reynolds, and one smaller bone, not his. This was no longer a hypothesis, it was reality. Rhea Mills Ranch, the cabin where the mysterious caller said it all started, was exactly that. This wasn't a place Mark was brought to by chance. It wasn't a spot the perpetrator visited once. It was a place someone came to, returned to, and revisited over 40 years. Finding Mark's remains was the biggest breakthrough in the case since 1980. The scattered, disturbed bones, no longer structurally intact, showed he'd been here a long time, long enough for the soil to change, long enough for someone to deliberately interfere. But the presence of a bone, not his, opened an entirely new door. There was a second victim, possibly tied to the 1981 disappearance. And this cabin wasn't just a grave for one. As dusk fell, the forensic team secured the scene, removed the GPR equipment, and covered the dig site with sealed tarps. Rangers stood before the cabin, gazing at the silent forest around. They understood. They hadn't just found Mark. They'd uncovered a secret someone tried to bury for 4 decades. From here, the 1980 case was no longer a disappearance. It was officially a murder. And not just one. As the remains were sent to the Texas Rangers Forensic Lab in Dallas, the investigation entered a wholly new phase, one where every assumption would be tested by science. Mark Everett Reynolds' bones, though no longer intact after 40 years of burial, digging, and reburial, still carried traces of what happened to him before being buried beneath Rhea Mills Ranch's soil. Forensic specialists began by arranging each bone by anatomical position. A large board was set up in the lab, where they pieced fragments together like a giant puzzle. Some had warped or eroded over time, but many, especially skull, rib, and long bones, retained traces, allowing inferences about cause of death. As soon as a shattered skull fragment was placed on the glass table, the lead forensic specialist, Dr. Leland Cortez, immediately noticed an unusual indentation at the occipital region, behind the head. It wasn't a break from time or decay. It bore signs of heavy impact from a blunt object, struck from behind. The indentation's edges were sharp, with star-shaped fracture lines radiating, a classic sign of a forceful, direct blow. Dr. Cortez said, voice low but certain, "Mark was struck from behind." This wasn't an accident. Everyone in the room grasped the weight of that statement. After 44 years, they finally had the first clear sign of violent action. Analyzing the ribs, they found some with compression fracture patterns, often caused by crushing or being slammed against a hard surface. This suggested Mark may have fallen, or been pinned under a heavy object before death. But the most surprising find came from an arm bone fragment. Under an electron microscope, its surface revealed tiny dark brown fibers, partially burned but intact enough for analysis. These weren't soil, roots, or fabric. They were wood fragments, cellulose fibers from softwood, coated with faint paint, and plant DNA traces showed pine, the exact wood used in the north cabin at Rhea Mills Ranch. Dr. Cortez turned to the rangers at the glass door. These wood fragments embedded in the bone while the victim was alive or at the moment of death, meaning Mark was forcefully impacted against the cabin's structure. At the cabin, the wood was rotted, walls peeling, but its core structure remained, pine, with old reddish-brown paint. The wood in Mark's bone meant he was struck or shoved against the cabin wall, hard enough for splinters to lodge in soft tissue. Now the cabin wasn't just a burial site, it was a scene of captivity and assault. Continuing deeper analysis, specialists used spectrometry to assess bone mineralization, revealing roughly when Mark died. Based on decay levels, they concluded a harsh truth. Mark didn't die immediately after being taken. He survived at least a few days to a week. A young ranger looked at the results, face paling. "You mean Mark was held before he was killed?" Dr. Cortez nodded. "There's slight inflammation at some fracture sites, showing they didn't occur at death, but while alive. The bones didn't heal, but there was a biological response. This could only mean Mark was struck, injured, held then killed later." Instantly, the north cabin became a site of captivity. Marks on the cabin walls, small dents, peeling wood, began to make sense. The areas of dug and redug soil also gained meaning. Someone may have returned to move the body, or to remove evidence, or to bury something else. Continuing injury analysis, specialists noted a vertical crack along the occipital bone, parallel to the initial indentation. This wasn't from the blow, it was a stress fracture from repeated force. Someone may have struck Mark multiple times, or slammed his head against a hard surface. In a preliminary report, Dr. Cortez wrote, "Based on bone trauma, Mark Everett Reynolds was likely held in a confined space, repeatedly impacted against a wooden structure, and sustained a fatal blow to the back of the head, leading to death." This report officially turned the case from a disappearance to a high-level homicide. But one more discovery silenced everyone. When classifying the small bone not belonging to Mark, they realized something suspicious. It was from a radius or ulna of a forearm, from someone slight. Its mineralization differed significantly from Mark's bones, meaning this person didn't die at the same time. If Mark died in 1980, the other bone fragment could have come from someone who died years before or after him. The forensic report stated clearly, the bone fragment does not belong to Mark. Second victim, identity and time of death, undetermined. Texas Rangers stood in the meeting room, staring at a nearly 20-page forensic summary. No one spoke for a few minutes. Everything they'd suspected, multiple burials at the cabin, soil disturbed in 3 distinct periods, was now backed by forensic evidence. Mark wasn't killed immediately. Mark was beaten, showing signs of inflammation. Mark was confined in the cabin. Mark was struck on the head from behind. Mark was buried, then someone returned, dug him up, and buried him again. And there, they also found traces of another person. When the Rangers left the forensic lab at day's end, they knew the investigation had fundamentally changed. Mark wasn't the victim of a spontaneous act, but the result of an organized, premeditated act with a period of captivity and the potential for repetition. And the mysterious man who called from the hospital was right. The old cabin, where it all started. But now, it was clear the cabin wasn't just the start of one case, but of a series of crimes. The analysis results for the bone fragment not belonging to Mark arrived from the Dallas DPS Forensic Lab, just 3 days after the initial forensic report was completed. Compared to analyzing Mark's remains, which involved cross-referencing bone age trauma and mineralization, the smaller, more intact second bone, found in a relatively distinct position, was processed faster. As soon as Ranger Alvarez read the first few lines of the report, he knew the Mark Reynolds case had opened a door no one in the team wanted. The bone belongs to a female, or small-statured male, age at death 17-25, the report began. But that wasn't what silenced the team. The next line was the critical one. Mitochondrial DNA matches a missing persons case, entered into NamUs in 2015, 1976, 4 years before Mark vanished, meaning the cabin was used even before Mark's case. Alvarez set the report down, silent for a few seconds. He knew they weren't facing a single murder, not even 2 random ones. The north cabin at Rhea Mills Ranch had become a crime scene potentially tied to multiple victims, and the second bone was the first proof. Identity of the second victim. NamUs, the U.S. database for missing persons and unidentified remains, began archiving pre-1980 cases after full digitization in the 2010 ed. Many old cases had mitochondrial DNA uploaded by relatives, awaiting a match. The mitochondrial DNA match from the small bone led Rangers to a 48-year-old file, Case hash TX 1976-112, Anna Louise Merritt, missing October 1976, age 19, freshman at a Denton Community College. The file described Anna last seen walking from an evening class back to her dorm. She vanished without a trace, no vehicle, no witnesses. In 1976, search capabilities were limited, no Amber Alert, no DNA analysis. After months of fruitless investigation, the case went cold and faded into obscurity. But now, nearly half a century later, a piece of her bone surfaced in the same burial pit as Mark Reynolds' remains. It's hard to describe the silence in the Rangers' meeting room when Anna's identity was confirmed. No one spoke. Only the smell of old paper and the steady hum of the air conditioner marked the pulse of a secret rising from the earth. Alvarez finally said one line. "This cabin didn't just bury Mark," another ranger sighed, then added, "it buried someone before him by nearly 4 years." The cabin as a repeated crime scene, returning to Rhea Mills Ranch. Rangers saw the cabin in a wholly new light. Yesterday, it was where Mark was held, beaten, and buried. Today, it was where at least 2 people were concealed, and possibly more. Evidence for this theory came not only from Anna's bone, but from the soil structure itself. Deepest layer, heavily compacted soil, like an old filled pit, likely where the first victim 1976 was buried. Middle layer, looser soil, quickly refilled matching Mark's 1980 disappearance. Top layer, surface disturbance, not deep as if someone returned years later to cover the scene or remove something. The significance of these 3 soil layers became clear. The cabin wasn't a one-time crime scene, it was a repeatedly used one. One ranger analyzed, whoever did this clearly knew the cabin was isolated, knew the land's layout, and was confident no one would come here for years. The cabin's walls also began telling their own story. When forensics examined the wood with reflective lighting, they saw old indentations, some from impacts, others from scratches, with varying ages based on the wood's decay. One technician whispered, "Some of these marks are far older than the wood fragment in Mark's bone. Based on depth and rot, they could date to the late 70s. This aligned chillingly with Anna Merritt's disappearance. The biggest question: who had access to the cabin from 1976 to 1980? Rhea Mills Ranch was privately owned in 1976 by a man named Howard C. Ellison, who died in 1991. Land records showed the cabins were rented to seasonal workers in summer, but from 1977 onward, the land was abandoned. By 1982, ownership transferred, but the cabins remained untouched. Meaning, during the victims' burials, 1976 and 1980, the cabins were almost always vacant and unchecked. Rangers reviewed lists of seasonal workers on the land during Ellison's time, but the lists were old, incomplete. Some names were penciled, faded, some pages were torn. But one thing stood out: only one group had free access to the cabins in that period. Ellison's workers in 1976 and 1977. If the perpetrator was among them, he'd know how remote the cabin was, know he could bury someone undetected, and know the paths well enough to return in 1980. The case's spirit shifts when Anna Merritt's identity was reconfirmed by NAMIS using 2 independent DNA methods. Alvarez knew they faced not just a murder, but a potential pattern, a killer with habits, rituals, or motives rooted over years. It was also when the team realized something profound. The killer didn't just murder Mark, he'd killed before, and the cabin was where he believed no one would find out. A memorable moment came in the Rangers' meeting room when a young officer looked at the newly built timeline and said softly, "Mark wasn't the first, and it's possible he wasn't the last. The killer wanted to hide here." No one responded. But that silence was the most valuable confirmation. The cabin becomes a shared grave. When investigators returned to the cabin to mark the burial pit again, they realized a horrific detail: the distance between where Mark's remains and Anna's bone were found was less than 40 cm, almost as if 2 bodies were buried in the same pit, later disturbed when the killer returned. Rhea Mills Ranch was no longer a place that buried one person, it became a shared grave for at least 2 victims. The question now wasn't who killed Mark. It was, how many were buried here? How many times did the killer return? And why this cabin? But before they could answer, they needed to know, who was the man who made the anonymous hospital call? And why did he only speak after 40 years? Information about the second victim, Anna Merritt, prompted Texas Rangers to review all records tied to Rhea Mills Ranch, former landowners, workers, those with cabin access from 1976 to 1980, and anyone who could have returned multiple times. The cabin's use at least twice for burials, 4 years apart, meant the killer didn't just stumble upon it. He belonged to it, knew it, and was confident no one would discover it. While reviewing land documents from Howard C. Ellison's era, the ranch's former owner, one name kept appearing in faint handwritten notes: Jeffrey Allen Coleman. In 1976, Coleman was a seasonal worker at the ranch, splitting wood and repairing fences. His record was unremarkable. A 24-year-old working a few summers, sleeping in the north cabin, paid in cash. But what caught the Rangers' attention was a detail from Collin County's property archives. Coleman briefly owned the north cabin. In 1978, Ellison, in debt, temporarily transferred the cabin to Coleman in a small off-the-books sale common in rural Texas. The deal was short. A year later, Ellison repaid the debt, and the cabin reverted to him. But this meant Coleman had a key to the cabin. Coleman had access during 1976, 1980. Coleman knew the cabin went unchecked. Coleman knew the land was abandoned in later years, and the fourth detail was what Rangers noticed most. From 1979, 1982, Coleman no longer lived locally. Yet Rangers reported a green pickup near Rhea Mills Ranch multiple times. The type Coleman owned. The pieces began to fit. Firestone tire treads, keep resurfacing. Another detail made Coleman an immediate top suspect. Old Denton County vehicle insurance records showed in 1979, Coleman bought a set of limited edition Firestone tires, matching the tread pattern at Mark's burned truck scene and the 1981 Hutchinson case. Tire company archives confirmed these tires were sold at only 3 North Texas stores for about 5 months. When Rangers checked purchase lists, Jeffrey A. Coleman's name was entry 12. No mistake, name, purchase date, tire serial number, matching Mark's disappearance, matching Hutchinson's case. This couldn't be explained as coincidence. Back to the cabin. Unignorable evidence. With Coleman's name recurring in records, Rangers returned to the cabin a third time to search every centimeter, now focusing on the cabin floor, under rotted beds and dust in wood crevices. In the first search, forensics targeted the burial pit and porch soil, but the cabin itself, with its aged planks, always risked hiding unexpected evidence. Specialists used blue and UV lights and high-resolution cameras to scan surfaces. In the cabin's left corner, where the floor was rotted, a small object glinted under UV. A technician gently reached into a wood crevice and pulled out an old metal Zippo lighter, dust-covered, dented on one side. But what made everyone hold their breath wasn't the lighter, it was the inscription, half faded, but still legible on its surface. J. Coleman, not drawn, not handwritten, etched with a metal tool, deep, sharp, and deliberate. The Rangers stood around the evidence, silent for a few seconds. This wasn't something casually left behind. Personal items with engraved names are rarely lent out, and if it was in the cabin, under the floor in the exact period of the third cabin, it meant Coleman was there, not once, not by chance. Woe is Coleman. Coleman's background did little to ease the team's concerns. Born 1952, worked odd jobs, fence repair, farm labor, delivery driver, minor record in 1975, for public disturbance, noted multiple times in police logs for arguing with neighbors, notably reputed to be aggressive, prone to fighting when drunk, no serious violent convictions, but Coleman's belligerent behavior and solitary lifestyle made him an unavoidable candidate in a case spanning years. Ranger Alvarez summed it up. Coleman had the opportunity, the time, the location, access to the cabin, the vehicle, and the Firestone tires. And now we have his personal item in the cabin. Another officer at the back of the table spoke up, and he left the area in 1982, right when the cabin was no longer Ellison's. But what sent chills through the team was this detail. The second victim, Anna Merritt, disappeared in 1976. Coleman lived in the cabin exactly during 1976. No one said Coleman is the killer. Not enough evidence yet. But all thought the same thing. If the cabin was the scene of multiple burials, Coleman was the only one fitting every intersection. Emerging questions. Ranger Alvarez sat before the timeline board, staring at 3 red lines, connecting 1976 to 1980 and 1981. 1976. Anna Merritt disappears. 1978. Coleman owns the cabin. 1980. Mark Reynolds disappears. 1981. Hutchinson disappears with the same Firestone tire treads. 3 points. 1 cabin. 1 potential suspect. He underlined 1978. Coleman was the only person proven to be at the cabin during Anna and Mark's disappearances. A young ranger asked, if he did it all, why didn't anyone suspect him for 40 years? The answer came from a document the team recently found in storage. In 1980, the year Mark vanished, Coleman left Frisco and moved to Oklahoma to live with an uncle. Any local suspicion would never reach him. If someone was digging, burying, and re-digging, he could have done it during visits or at night, not staying in Frisco long enough to be noticed. A sudden break. Coleman is still alive, expecting to search death records. The Rangers were stunned to discover something unexpected. Jeffrey Allen Coleman, 72 years old, was still alive, residing in a mobile home park in Durant, Oklahoma. After over 40 years, the first potential suspect in the Rhea Mills Ranch burials was alive and could be questioned. As the meeting ended, Ranger Alvarez said something that silenced the room. The cabin doesn't lie. The Firestone tires don't lie. The lighter doesn't lie. Now it's Coleman's turn to talk. As Texas Rangers prepared to head to Durant to question Jeffrey Coleman, an urgent call from Methodist Denton Hospital forced them to turn back mid-route. The anonymous caller, the man who said go to Rhea Mills Ranch, the old cabin, had finally woken after days in a coma. His name Walter Briggs, 67 years old, former occupation, mobile auto mechanic, worked around Collin and Denton counties in the late 70s and early 80s. Ranger Alvarez immediately sent 2 agents to the hospital. Briggs lay in bed, gaunt, skin sallow, hands trembling slightly, but his eyes, though weary, were alert in the way of someone who'd held a secret too long, and now wanted to unburden. When asked if he could talk, Briggs nodded slowly, then whispered, I've stayed silent 44 years, but I can't take it to the grave. Alvarez sat beside him, patient. He knew if Briggs was indeed the suppressed witness, his statement could be the biggest piece since finding Mark's remains. Briggs began in a raspy voice, but each sentence was clear, as if they'd lived in his mind for 4 decades. I knew Coleman. He hired me to clean his truck. Ranger Alvarez asked gently, when? Briggs took a deep breath. Summer of 1980, right after Mark Reynolds disappeared. The room fell eerily silent. Briggs recounted that he was an independent mechanic, making house calls. One evening in August 1980, Coleman knocked on his door, looking unusual, hurried, anxious, clothes smeared with dirt and sweat. Coleman said his truck was stuck in mud and had something dirty people wouldn't want to see. Briggs assumed it was oil or animal remains from the truck bed, but when he went to Coleman's backyard to check the truck, he froze. The wheel wells were caked with dark red streaks, a sharp metallic smell, not dirt, not rust, not grease. Briggs swallowed and asked, what is this? Coleman gave him a cold stare. You don't ask, I pay. Briggs said, trembling, I've seen blood before. I work on cars. I know the smell. He paused for a few seconds. It was human blood. Ranger Alvarez felt a chill down his spine. Briggs continued, Coleman made me clean the truck, scrub the undercarriage, the bed, everything. He watched me the whole time, didn't take his eyes off me for a second, but that wasn't the most critical part. Briggs closed his eyes for a few seconds before saying, Coleman wasn't alone that night. There was a second person. The room seemed to stop breathing. "Did you see their face?" Alvarez asked. Briggs replied, "Not clearly, it was dark. But I saw a figure near the porch, taller than Coleman, thinner." They argued quietly. The other guy said, "Don't leave any traces." Coleman said, "I've got it covered." Rangers exchanged glances. This was the first mention of a partner. Briggs continued, "I wanted to tell the police, I swear I did, but..." He lifted his hospital gown slightly, revealing a long scar on his shoulder, old, faded, but still distinct. "A week later, outside my house, someone hit me with a wooden club. I didn't see their face, but I heard the voice." Coleman's voice. Briggs trembled. He said, "You open your mouth, you'll end up in the ground like that Reynolds guy." That was why Walter Briggs stayed silent for 44 years. That was why he called anonymously when he knew he was dying. That was why he pointed them to the cabin. Rangers asked, "Why the cabin? How did you know?" Briggs answered instantly, without hesitation, "I heard Coleman tell the second guy, 'Take it to the cabin. We'll finish the rest.'" One sentence, just one sentence, from 1980. But that sentence was the compass guiding the entire investigation to Rhea Mills Ranch, where Mark's remains and Anna's bone were found. To verify Briggs' account, Rangers asked, "Did you ever see the cabin? Did you go there?" Briggs shook his head. "I never went there." That was the most crucial detail. Walter Briggs didn't know where the cabin was. He didn't know the north cabin existed. He didn't know Mark's burial pit was right in front of it, yet he'd led them to the exact spot holding the remains, solely from a memory of Coleman's words 44 years ago. Briggs ended his statement with a tired but firm voice. "I didn't want to die carrying this. I hated him. I feared him. But I feared the wrong more. Don't let him get away." Ranger Alvarez nodded slowly. He knew from the moment Briggs spoke, the case had shifted. No longer suspicion. No longer coincidence. No longer forensic guesswork. Now they had a direct witness, identification of behavior, confirmation Coleman was involved right after Mark vanished. Evidence Coleman cleaned a truck with human blood, revelation of Coleman with a second person, and a threat to silence. Briggs had opened a door no one found for 40 years, a door leading straight to the truth about Mark Reynolds, and possibly, to the identity of an accomplice still hidden. Walter Briggs' testimony was like a torch piercing the 40-year darkness of the case. The Rangers were no longer facing a single suspect. Briggs had mentioned a second person, someone with Coleman the night Mark Reynolds vanished, and the phrase "don't leave any traces from that tall, thin man" rang like a wake-up call for the entire investigation. Texas Rangers began reviewing everyone named in the 1980 file, especially those briefly questioned and dismissed too quickly. One name jumped out immediately: Terry Malone. Malone was mentioned early in the Mark Reynolds investigation, but ruled out due to work alibi, and no connection to Mark. Two brief notes but unconvincing given the 1980 file's missing pages and tampered evidence. Rangers rechecked his personnel file, and then, a truth hit them hard. Malone was a reserve police officer in southern Frisco in 1980. This matched Briggs' description perfectly. The second person was tall and thin, knew how to move around unnoticed, knew how to intimidate without leaving traces, knew how to stay quiet as police chased wrong leads. A reserve officer, trained but lightly supervised, was exactly the type who could help Coleman threaten Briggs, blind neighbors, and make the 1980 file slide into cold storage faster. Ranger Alvarez slammed his hand on the table. "Malone is the second guy. No doubt about it." As Rangers tracked Malone, they uncovered something even more suspicious. Malone left Texas in March 1982. No forwarding address, no transfer of personnel records, no resignation paperwork, just gone. From 1990 onward, Malone lived under a new name in Arkansas, working odd jobs at old garages. He was never arrested, but never stayed anywhere long. Those traits: constant movement, avoiding residency registration, using temporary aliases, matched the behavior of someone evading discovery. A call to the Sebastian County, Arkansas sheriff confirmed, Terry Malone, now 67, was living in Fort Smith, renting a room at a cheap motel. He worked at an old auto shop, where he had access to chemicals, tools, and an environment where no one asked questions. One ranger whispered, "No way it's a coincidence. He's been living like a fugitive for over 40 years. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Coleman, suspect number 1, remained in Durant, Oklahoma. He didn't change his name. He didn't hide his address. He didn't go into hiding, but that didn't make him less dangerous. Sometimes killers don't flee, because they believe no one remembers, and Coleman believed that for 4 decades. Rangers split into 2 teams, Team 1 to Durant to arrest Jeffrey Coleman, Team 2 to Fort Smith to arrest Terry Malone. 2 arrest warrants were urgently signed by a Texas judge, with initial charges: first-degree murder, tied to Mark Reynolds' death in 1980, based on remains, forensics witness testimony, and cabin evidence. Arrest of Jeffrey Coleman. Durant, Oklahoma. Team 1 arrived at Coleman's mobile home park at 5:40 a.m., when a suspect is least likely to react. They surrounded the area, knocked hard, and shouted, "Texas Rangers, open the door." Sounds came from inside. A shadow moved behind the curtain. Coleman opened the door, gray hair, tangled beard, eyes tired but sharp. But when he saw Rangers in tactical vests, his face changed instantly. Alvarez read the warrant. "Jeffrey Allen Coleman, you're under arrest for the murder of Mark Everett Reynolds in 1980. Coleman muttered one vague sentence, as if to himself, 40 years, and you still found me. Arrest of Terry Malone. Fort Smith, Arkansas. Team 2 reached the auto shop where Malone worked. He was under an old pickup, unaware the world outside had shifted entirely. As officers stormed in, Malone wiped grease from his clothes, his face paling when he saw the Texas Rangers' 5-pointed star badge. "Terry Lee Malone, you're under arrest, first-degree murder." Malone didn't resist. He just stepped back. The lead ranger asked, "You know what case we're talking about, don't you?" Malone looked at the ground, sighed. If Briggs talked, it's all over. One sentence, an indirect admission, and proof he was the one who attacked Briggs in 1980 to silence him. When both suspects were cuffed, one truth emerged. Coleman, the cabin's owner, Malone, the 1980 reserve officer, both left Texas in 1982. Both owned pickup trucks. One had Firestone tires. One had the authority to intimidate witnesses, now arrested in different states, but the thread between them never broke. The Mark Reynolds case, after 44 years, finally entered its decisive phase. The trial of Jeffrey Coleman and Terry Malone took place at the Collin County Courthouse, Texas, drawing heavy media attention, locals, and families who'd silently endured loss for decades. This wasn't just a trial for a 1980 case. It was an effort to close a dark 44-year chapter in Texas, a chapter the rotting cabin at Rhea Mills Ranch had kept buried for nearly half a century. From the first days, prosecutors presented a barrage of evidence linking Coleman and Malone. Forensic bone analysis confirmed Mark was struck from behind, showed inflammation, and was held before death. Wood from the cabin embedded in bone was direct proof Mark was forcefully impacted inside the cabin, where Coleman once lived and Malone frequented. The cabin was used for burial, digging reburial multiple times, matching when Coleman lived there and when Malone left Texas in 1982. A gut punch to the jury. A second victim was found in the same burial pit. Mitochondrial DNA confirmed Anna died when Coleman lived at the cabin. Prosecutors displayed side-by-side photos from Mark's scene, the 1981 Hutchinson case, and Coleman's Firestone tire purchase receipt. No question, though Coleman dodged every question, the tire treads couldn't be disputed. The treads were his signature. Briggs was brought into the courtroom, under special protection. His voice was weak, but his words cut like a blade. "I cleaned the blood-soaked truck," I heard him say, "take it to the cabin." Terry Malone was standing right there. The jury hung on every word. No one took their eyes off Briggs, the man threatened and nearly beaten to death, just for wanting to tell the truth. The Zippo lighter engraved with J. Coleman was presented in court. Found under the cabin floor, near Mark's bones. Prosecutors concluded, evidence doesn't crawl into a cabin, Only its owner puts it there. Prosecutors traced Malone's knowledge of police procedures, his ability to derail the initial investigation, and his 1980 threat to Briggs. Briggs' testimony about Malone's voice, "If you talk, you'll end up like Reynolds," was read aloud in court. Malone bowed his head. No objection. Jeffrey Coleman stayed silent most of the trial. With each piece of evidence, he just stared at the floor, his foot twitching slightly. Terry Malone, in contrast, reacted strongly at times. When Anna's DNA was mentioned, when Briggs identified his voice, when the Firestone treads were raised, but it was all futile, the evidence left no room for denial. In a special hearing, prosecutors revealed a new finding: the 1980 evidence inventory signature, R. Kincaid, was forged. Comparing signatures from personnel files showed clear differences. Different slant, different stroke, different pressure. Handwriting analysis concluded the two signatures couldn't be from the same person. This caused a stir in the courtroom. No one expected the 1980 case had been tampered with by a third person, someone with access to the evidence room, who removed two critical witness statements, who could conceal Coleman and Malone's tracks. The prosecutor looked straight at the jury. This shows there wasn't just a killer, there was a cover-up. The third person's identity wasn't revealed. The investigation would continue. But this trial focused on the two directly responsible for the atrocities. After 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. No one blinked as the judge asked, "Have we reached a verdict?" The jury four-person stood. For Jeffrey Allen Coleman, first-degree murder, guilty. For Terry Lee Malone, first-degree murder, guilty. The maximum penalty proposed: life imprisonment without parole. Mark's family broke into tears. Anna's family clutched each other's hands. Briggs bowed his head, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, as if he'd finally set down a 44-year burden. Coleman stared blankly ahead. Malone closed his eyes. Both knew the day they stepped into the cabin in 1976 and 1980, they'd set foot on a path with no return. The verdict closed a 4-decade case, but it also opened a larger question: if the 1980 signature was forged, if two witness statements vanished, if the cabin was used multiple times undetected, who had been shielding Coleman and Malone back then? A third person, a shadow still unseen. But the Frisco community, now a grown city, knew one thing: the silence of 1980 was over. Justice had finally reached where it needed to go. The story of Mark Everett Reynolds, the charred F-150, by Lake Louisville, the rotting cabin at Rhea Mills Ranch, sounds like a crime film, but it cuts deep into American life today, a story of trust, community responsibility, and how justice sometimes arrives late but never comes, if people give up. Mark was abducted on a rural Frisco road still wild, held in a cabin truly middle of nowhere, struck from behind, then hastily buried under 3 layers of soil, buried, dug up, buried again, like someone trying to bury the truth. For years, the 1980 investigation failed. 2 file pages went missing. Evidence signatures were forged. A reserve officer like Terry Malone wore a community protector badge while complicit in covering crimes. It's a painful reminder that even in a society valuing the rule of law like America, people can abuse power, and systems only work when someone dares to check, dares to ask questions. But that same America produced the new Texas Rangers, GPR Tech, DNA, NAMA systems, allowing old graves to be dug up and families to hear, "We haven't forgotten." And above all, an ordinary man like Walter Briggs, threatened, nearly beaten to death, silent for 44 years, yet still picking up the phone from his hospital bed to say, "Go to the old cabin." The lesson for Americans today isn't just be careful on dark roads, but don't dismiss what you see wrong. Keep records, photos, information, support cold case units, and when needed, be brave like Briggs, because sometimes a single late testimony can pull justice back from the earth. If the 44-year journey to justice for Mark Reynolds and the truth buried at Rhea Mills Ranch truly moves you, please hit subscribe to join us for more stories. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue uncovering America's untold secrets.